what are some of the practical consequences in Jewish life of a secular humanistic Jewish approach to Jewish history? What are some of the changes that maybe come about, or different approaches that we take?
Well, for one thing, we're not just accepting by rote the supernatural sayings and stuff. I mean, we're willing, for example, we're willing to rewrite, songs and sayings and the blessings at candles and the things you say when someone dies, and because you're willing to consider all these things, these rational things, as Jewish as well, not just the prayer or the things like that.
Sure. Cindy, please.
It's much less litigious. There's no shame associated with, oh, you didn't do this right, you didn't get this perfect, you didn't, have everything exactly in line, exactly as it should be, and so now it doesn't count. And it's, you can kind of take it or leave it to some extent, but really it's more about what makes sense for you in your life and your situation versus what made complete sense at a time and place incredibly distant from now.
Once you accept the evolution of Jewish life, which the history reveals to you, that justifies your own choices and evolution as circumstances change or your values change.
Well, I don't, this comes from just studying mythology. I don't know if it exactly applies to this, but when you look at mythology, you find it has a lot of different levels. And if you work your way down to the other levels, you get a lot deeper meaning of what they're actually saying. It's, the surface isn't not necessarily what the basic thing is about the whole myth. And I think you could probably transfer that to this.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, if you consider the Bible a big myth, then you study it like you study myth.
Right. It's literature, and that's fine, or it's myth, and it has sort of almost archaeological layers to it. And you can also uncover those layers. Thinking about the origins of the Jewish holidays in agriculture before there was the Exodus layer added onto them, and before the rabbinic interpretations were layered on. That's sort of a cultural excavation that we're doing.
I think it tells you a lot more about Jewish life than just reading it as said. Well,
I think that the four different sort of editors, that they talk about within the Torah, if you can get past this is divinely given, and even though the contradictions are there and everything, and begin to examine, well, here's a voice from the priests, and they're pushing their particular thing, and here's a voice from from the southern kingdom, which is sort of pushing Jerusalem as the center and dissing Israel, and all of a sudden you begin to see why there are these contradictions within it, which shows the different levels, as Kathy's saying, the different parts that I mean, the Jews weren't a homogenous group of people. They were clearly had a lot of differences, and they were also evolving from a sort of basic Canaanite religious set of ideals, where there's lots of gods, to this monotheistic idea, and it was a difficult transition, and you can see that when you're reading the text.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It's interesting to see how that happened.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, because we don't have a lot of other evidence outside of the Bible itself showing us these sorts of things.
I mean, I'd also argue that it's interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a more complex story, and sometimes you have a lot more I don't knows or maybe or probablys than you get in just the mythological version. But that's more interesting. And the other argument in its favor is that there's a dignity to the truth. I want to know what really happened.
Yeah.
And even if it's not the nicest story, or even if it doesn't always show us in the best light, I want to find out what really happened, and I can live with that. And that's important too. I will say that sometimes this will divide us from other organized approaches to Jewish life, who do want to preserve the myth and who do want to, have that second naivete, and so they can still say the old blessings. And so we're not learning the same blessings. We're not saying the same blessings, even if we're reading the same story. We're reading it very differently. So that's a consequence. But I would also argue that studying history can be a source of inspiration, even transcendence, where you feel connected to people who lived centuries before you, and they touch you in an emotional way. It's your people's past, you know. I mean, I can study, you know, Australopithecus and say, well, that's my past. But when I study,
That's a harder one to
it's a little further,
with.
it's a little further back.
It is.
But it is. I can study, you know, the prokaryotes or the trilobites, you know, that's my past, but again, it's a long way back. But when I study Jewish history, there's something evocative and emotional for me, you know, when you touch the stone or you see the site. Or, when I took our last trip to secular Israel in 2019, we went to see a synagogue in Sapporo, which is a beautifully preserved mosaic floor, including a zodiac and some other things you wouldn't expect to see in a synagogue. And we only were there about 15 minutes and we had to leave because they were setting up for a bar mitzvah. And I loved the fact that they were going to celebrate a bar mitzvah in a synagogue that was 1,500 years old. You know, there was something really beautifully transcendent about that moment. Even just seeing them set up the podium and put the chairs in and whatever. I really was glad we were able to see that. That's the transcendence of history that's possible. Okay, second question. How might one teach a biblical story that is historically dubious, like Adam and Eve or Noah and the flood?
Well, if you can, so if we start with the premise that these things probably didn't happen, you know, and then you go into why are these particular stories preserved? What do they tell us about the culture and thought process of the people who devised these stories in order to explain things that they couldn't explain?
So it's clues to the authorship rather than accepting what they're telling,
right?
You know, what they're talking.
But it's also clues to why we think the way, why Jews think the way they do in some ways, because they relate back to these origin myths.
So treating it as a starting point for ideas and motifs and issues that are carried through later history. You have to get the joke, right? Like if you don't get the reference, you're not going to get it. So, for example, there's a William Faulkner novel, Absalom. Right.
Yeah.
And if you don't know the story of King David and his son and the rebellion and the General Joab and what happens after, I mean, if you don't know any of that, this is just a weird name. That's the start of the novel. And so it adds that layer of getting the joke and understanding the resonance. So for Jewish cultural literacy, you've got to know these stories to understand what they're talking about.
Well, even the Leonard Cohen songs occasionally.
Oh, sure.
Because he uses references to things like this all the time, and you go like, oh. I mean, I have to admit that until you did the one on Passover with, you know, who by fire, you know, not Passover, it was Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah.
And I never made that connection. It was just a song I liked, but I didn't understand that there was a connection to
the Jewish.
Yeah. So yeah.
Cindy, I see your hands up.
I just having been in enough literature classes and whatever, looking at other mythologies, there's also been an opportunity to kind of consider that what we think we know now may be considered foolish or just ridiculous in, you know, another few hundred years or, you know, however long it might be. And it doesn't even take that long, really. My great grandmother, when she was a kid, they believed germ theory was still new, and they believed that germs traveled on feathers. And so when you or your neighbor were plucking your chickens or geese or whatever it was that you were about to cook, you made sure that all of your windows were shut tight so that you didn't get any feathers into your house because you didn't want germs. You know, and now we kind of chuckle at that and, like, you know, find it pretty quaint, I guess. But, you know, looking at these origin or you know, super early myths compared to other myths of that time, similar myths from other cultures and places, it gives us, I think, some humility about our own knowledge and our own certainty in what we think we know.
Rudyard Kipling wrote a whole series of just so stories that claim to explain why the giraffe has a long neck and why the zebra has stripes, and they're all made up. But they're imaginative, and it's the same kind of origin story that we have in many biblical accounts. And after all, to some extent, the Torah is an origin story for the Jewish people.
Right.
Just not for, Hebrew stripes.
Can I see if something else is relevant?
Sure.
Because one of the things we got into was that myths and history really do the same thing in some way. They explain something about your culture and your society and try to say how they get that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something you can use. I don't know how old you have to be, but when you're teaching a biblical story like that, to say these are two ways. This is one way to discuss what happened to us, maybe more emotionally or mentally than physically, and it explains this. But the real history doesn't have anything to do with this.
Right.
And they're different things trying to do the same thing.
Yep.
And
it's good for kids to learn by a relatively early age, they know that there weren't three little pigs that built houses, right? They know the story, but they also know it's a story, and it didn't really happen. At a young age, they might not make as hard and fast a division of those things. And I sometimes use the analogy of, you're pretending you can fly, and you're flying around your house, but then you get to the top of the stairs, and you have to decide, can I really fly?
Yeah.
or am I, is this imagination? And so kids can get that concept of what really happened versus the story relatively early if you put it in simple terms. And they understand that there's, a value to both approaches. So that's how we try to teach the stories as these are the stories our people told. If they can learn Greek mythology and not go worshiping Zeus, they can learn this stuff and not become super pious.
But I think it gives you an excuse if you want to use those myths, like saying them in temple or something.
Yeah, sure.
We use them because they are valid in their own way. You just have to realize it's not the same kind of validity that you get from, walking out the door and finding it's raining.
So one example of an approach you can take is you tell them in the present tense instead of telling them in the past tense.
Oh, that's a point.
So what does that do? Well, when I tell the story of Hansel and Gretel go through the forest to grandmother's house. It's not that they went through the forest as if they really existed. It's the literary present. And so when I try to tell biblical stories, I'll tell them as, this is the literary present of Cain and Abel go out into the field, and then Cain says to Abel so-and-so, and this is what happens. So, you explain it that way, then it's more like a story that's happening every time you're telling it, as opposed to an event that happened in history that has a past tense version. And I guess the last approach that might be valuable is you can grapple with the ethical values presented in the story.
Right.
You might agree with them, you might disagree with them, but again, you're evaluating the story as you were saying, as a message, as something people were trying to convey something, and we can inhabit their minds and see what they were trying to say in some way. Okay, the third question. Why is this a central practice of secular humanistic Judaism? We talked about this a little bit earlier. We don't have to get in too deep, although I will point out that it does help to know more. So if you need ammunition, sometimes having some historical knowledge is useful, and even lets you provide a counter narrative to the traditional values and justify the choices that you're making that may differ. Okay, number 4, why might other Jewish movements who accept the same factual conclusions about Jewish history be reluctant to make ritual or theological changes to agree with those conclusions? Why don't they change the liturgy? Why don't they change what they teach in Sunday school to match what the history says?
To quote Tevye, tradition.
No, I think it has to do with what I said before. They still feel it has value as a different way of looking at how they feel about things or used to think about things, that it's, part of the basis of your culture.
Right, and actually what they want is to lay a foundation at first before you ask the harder questions. Mm-hmm. And then the question becomes, at what age is it appropriate to ask those questions? Is it at 12 before their bar mitzvah? Is it at 15 before a confirmation? Is it in the middle of rabbinical school? And if you don't get that high, then you never ask those questions. I mean, think about the reaction that this conservative congregation had to their rabbi saying what he learned in rabbinical school, that the Exodus didn't happen historically the way it's described in the Passover Haggadah and in the book of Exodus. But he hadn't prepped the ground. Right? Yeah. People were shocked because they'd never heard that before. And what they had heard was, this is the Torah that Moses placed before the people of Israel, from the mouth of God in the hand of Moses. Like, exactly right. Correct. divinely inspired and true. And they'd heard, blessed are you, God, who gave us his Torah. And they took it out. I mean, their kids had learned that Moses received the entire Torah on Mount Sinai. I mean, that's what had been taught consistently in Sunday school and adult education. And well, if you want to start poking holes in things, maybe you need to carry it through. And that's our approach. But part of the disjuncture for that congregation was that this came out of nowhere from their perspective compared to everything else they'd ever heard about this history. But just to finish the thought, for some people, continuity with that past tradition is more important than a strict consistency with their intellectual conclusions. And so when they come to synagogue, however often they come, they want it to sound like what they know, and they don't want to learn a new blessing that's changed from. They want to do what their ancestors did, and if it's a little bit of as-ifing and second naivete and make believe, then they'll do that. But that's their valuing of continuity and their willingness to limit the knowledge to those who can handle it. You know, the scholars and the rabbis, but not necessarily putting it out into the general congregation, because after all, some people just don't want to think too much about what they're doing. You know, they don't go to church for that. They don't go to synagogue for that. They're going for something else.
Well, doesn't it also create the potential issue of people saying, like, well, why am I bothering to come here? You know, why is this guy my rabbi if he's going to, if we question these things, then what's the point of my coming to church or to temple at all? I mean.
Well, and you even get people who like something more traditional, the less traditional they are. It's like almost compensatory. You know, you send it. I remember I went to 2 weddings within 6 months of each other, one in a Reform temple and one in a conservative synagogue. And I heard the word tradition during the wedding more at the Reform temple than I did at the conservative one, as sort of a, you know, almost the lady protests too much, you know, that they want to feel even more traditional, even if they're less traditional. So, you know, the person who never goes to synagogue, when they go, they want it to be exactly the way they remembered it and not change it. I have a friend whose sister-in-law is a rabbi, and in her first congregation, which was an older Reformed Jewish congregation in Connecticut, she loved the congregation. It was fun, it was creative, and then high holidays came, and they started playing a pipe organ during the service. And she said, "What is going on with this pipe organ? It sounds so churchy to me." But you may or may not recall that the Reform movement in some of its earlier incarnations was kind of churchy in its choirs and even in its use of pipe organs, in its imitation of the surrounding cultural practices. And some of these people had grown up with that old classical style of Reform Judaism that included a pipe organ, and that's what they wanted. They wanted it the way they remembered it. And this is the way we've always done it. Never underestimate the power of this is the way we've always done it. Even among people who are, I mean, I hear it in Humanistic Judaism when people say, how can you change the melody? This is the way we've always done it. And I say, are you paying attention to what we've done with everything else? With everything else we've changed, like we have to be open to change. But some people simply, you know, want it the way they're used to it, or they just choose to think differently in the congregational setting, and they don't carry it all the way.
Never heard of pipe organ in a temple.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if kids don't at a certain age sort of just naturally start asking questions about things like that. I mean, you know, I don't know how old they are. We don't have any kids, so we can't tell. But it seems to me that my friends and I, when we got to be about 11 or 12, we got curious about all kinds of things and asked, is this really so? This doesn't make sense. Can you tell me about this? I mean, doesn't that sort of
Yeah, I mean, look, the X-Files put it well. The truth is out there. All right? I mean, maybe their truths were made up, but the truth is out there. You're going to find this archaeological stuff. You're going to find this critical history out there. It could be a YouTube video. It could be a book. You could take a class in Jewish history in college and they blow your mind. I mean, I had this happen. I was a teaching assistant for a survey Jewish history class. It was like a survey of Jewish life, introduction to Jewish studies or something. And the professor in the very first class said, well, you know, all those patriarchs, that's all mythical. And the look on the kids' faces, especially the ones that had gone to Jewish day school, was like you killed their grandparent. I mean, what do you mean? And one of them said, but I went to Rachel's tomb and I got the string that they sold there, and And he said, well, anybody can call it Rachel's tomb. I mean, that's like, that's a touristy thing.
Church of the Nativity.
Yeah, right. Or the True Cross, right? How many pieces of the True Cross are there?
It's enough to pave the road to Jerusalem from there.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, anyone can make a relic or a shrine. It doesn't make the person real.
No.
But again, people were so used to that old model that getting the critical model was a challenge for them. But the truth is out there. And the other argument I would make to people who are sort of on the fence about teaching this to kids is there's part of me that just doesn't want to lie to my kids. So I actually was in a Facebook discussion recently on the question of the tooth fairy, because this man who's he's part of the modern Orthodox world, except he's really more conservative in practice, but he's Harvard educated, very bright guy. And he said that his youngest daughter figured out that he was the tooth fairy. And then decided she wanted to believe in it anyways. And he loved it as an example of that second naivete, choosing to believe in something.
That's what I did. I was afraid they'd stop giving me dimes.
There's also the economic motivation here if you want to be Marxist about it, right? But yes, there's that profit motive. The reality is, though, that you have to decide, am I going to perpetuate this myth of the tooth fairy, or am I going to tell them the truth? Now, what do we do with our kids, with the tooth fairy or Santa Claus? We thought about it, and we said, you know what, let's take the approach of some people think it is and some people think it isn't, and you have to make up your own mind.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, and so one of my daughter's best friends did believe in Santa Claus, and they were a very Santa Claus focused family, but we didn't want our child to have a complex about, Santa Claus goes to all the good kid houses and never comes here. So we didn't give her positive reinforcement, but we didn't say it's not true. We just said, some people think it's true and some people think it's not, and what do you think? And then 6 months later, in our car, I think driving down to the Field Museum or the Shedd Aquarium, all of a sudden from the back seat in her car seat we hear, Santa Claus couldn't be real. You couldn't land on a roof with all those reindeer, and if you fell down a chimney, you would die.
Reality is.
We said, okay. The wheels had been turning, and she was thinking it out, and she came to a conclusion. But we were going to reinforce it positively for her because we don't believe it's true. But we want to reinforce her making her own decisions on that question, and it worked out fine in the end because she did so. So the last question for us to talk about, and then we'll wrap up, is how can secular humanistic Judaism answer the question, why did the Jewish people survive? If not divine providence, why did the Jewish people survive all those centuries?
Because Jews made an effort to survive.
Okay, human effort, that counts.
There's not a why in a sense of a purpose. But
no, but the how.
The how, yeah. Because people chose to continue to be Jewish and survive.
They were determined not to have to change it. They didn't want to.
They were a stiff-necked people.
Yeah, but that works, doesn't it?
Right. And also, don't forget that they had a religious conviction that they were separate and chosen. Whether or not it was true, they believed it. And so why would they become part of the hoi polloi everybody else in the world when they're the elect few? That's a way of maintaining that conviction, like the Shakers, all these other sects that justify themselves by saying we are the elite, we are the elect, we are the chosen ones. It has a survival value to it.
There's also though the oppressive nature of Christian societies, and Muslim societies were not necessarily oppressive, but they created separate communities for Jews and Christians, the dhimmi. That also helps you to survive because you're not allowed to, you can't assimilate, so therefore you don't.
Limits the ways to get out. Although in both Islam and Christianity, until the Inquisition, you could convert out. After the Inquisition, there was this idea of the cleanliness of the blood, and it became more racial. But you could convert out in the 900s in both Islam and Christianity. But the quirky part about both of them is that they were oppressed, but they were also tolerated to a greater or lesser extent, a different time, a different place. So under Christianity, the idea was the Jews were a witness. They're a witness to what happens if you reject Christ, but they're also kept around as a witness of the days of Christ, so that in the end, when he returns, he can convert them, and that will be part of the eschaton. But you need Jews around to convert at the end for that to happen. And in Islam, there was a category of the dhimmi, the tolerated
Right.
minority with the revelation, like Christians and Jews, who had to accept a kind of second-class status, but could survive and even thrive within those limitations of the dhimmi people. So Jews had a tolerated position, unlike pagans, unlike Zoroastrians to some extent, and certainly pagans in Europe got largely wiped out by Christendom in a way that Jews didn't in every time and place. Jews also had some interesting cultural advantages. They emphasized literacy, for example, when most peoples didn't. And it wasn't that all Jews were perfectly literate in everything, but enough were that gave them commercial advantages, that gave them service to the ruler advantages, so they could read the medical textbooks and become court physicians like Maimonides was. They could work in languages and translate as they did during the Renaissance. They could be go-betweens between the Christian and the Muslim empire because they were neither, and so they could trade in ways that those two peoples could not. And they learned the diaspora skills of marginality, how to connect to the broader culture and speak its language without having it overwhelm you. That's a particular skill that they're not the only ones to have done, but they did it very well. And also keep in mind, part of it was that keeping themselves distinct, and part of it was adapting. Jews wore different clothes in different parts of the world where they lived, and they were exposed to the foods of the peoples around them. And they found different ways to accommodate those surrounding circumstances. So actually adaptability and flexibility was a survival advantage, not just preserving tradition. And the last argument you can make is that the Jews are not the only minority that survived the diaspora. There are the Roma people. There are the Armenians, who did not have their own kingdom for centuries. Their kingdom was destroyed by the Roman Empire, I believe. So they managed to preserve an identity and a church and a language and a peoplehood, and they even had their own Holocaust. I mean, you have clearly other examples of peoples that have made it, and they didn't have a divinely chosen path laid out for them either. And it's interesting that Armenians also speak many languages, have commercial skills and international contacts, and the same kind of cultural features that help the Jews survive and even thrive. The Armenians also have elements of that in their culture too. So, as they say, the Jews are like everybody else, only more so. All right, so we don't have class next time, and when we do come back together, we're going to ask our last sort of philosophical general question before turning to our intellectual roots in secular humanistic Judaism, and that is the question of the balance of past and present. Which has more authority? The cultural traditions we've inherited, or our values today and how we would articulate them, and how do we balance attachments to both of those? So that's what we'll be turning to talk about next time.